They say you should forgive everyone, especially the ones who never said sorry. What a charming idea. And by charming, I mean completely insane if you've actually lived long enough to collect a few real betrayals. Welcome to Buddhist Wisdom for the Elderly, where we don't sugarcoat enlightenment. We unwrap it like an old hard candy at the bottom of your purse. Sticky, real, and somehow still useful. In today's video, we explore why pretending to be fine is more dangerous than being sad, why your triggers aren't flaws but flashing neon signs from your nervous system, and how your ego, bless its overworked little heart, has been cosplaying as your personality for the last 50 years. Each part will give you the phrase we tend to live by, I'm fine, for instance, why it quietly hurts like hell, a real story of someone finally cracking that facade, and a better truth to live instead. But the part you can't afford to miss is part 8, where we break the myth of silent forgiveness. If you've ever confused people-pleasing with compassion, this one will liberate you, or at least make you finally cancel Christmas dinner with your cousin who never brings anything. So, take a breath. Maybe even unclench your jaw for the first time since 1993. Like, subscribe, and help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers so we can keep making videos that speak to your soul without pretending it's fine. Let's begin. Part 1. The pain was already there before they arrived. You think it was the betrayal, the silence, the rejection. But what if the real injury came long before the person you're blaming even showed up? Pain doesn't begin when someone leaves. It begins when something inside you has already gone unanswered for years. The breakup didn't create your hurt. It pressed on something that was already sore. Take someone who gets visibly upset when they're ignored. They say it's about feeling disrespected. What it's really about is a history of being invisible, at home, in school, in a relationship that only worked when they kept quiet. Reactions don't happen in a vacuum. They happen in a body that remembers, and yours does. It remembers who didn't call, who didn't protect you, who loved you only when you were convenient. That memory isn't a conscious list. It's a nervous system that flinches before your mind catches up. This is why you don't just feel sad, you unravel. Not because today's situation is catastrophic, but because it's layered over 20 others you never resolved. When someone says the wrong thing and you feel crushed, they didn't ruin your peace. They walked into a wound they didn't know existed. You didn't know either. Not really. Buddhist teachings suggest that suffering arises from attachment and aversion. But here's what we don't always say out loud. Most of us are attached to our pain because we haven't seen anything else. It becomes the framework for our relationships. It decides who we trust, how we respond, and what we believe we deserve. You're not overreacting. You're responding from a place that's been asking to be seen for decades. And until that place gets your attention, it'll keep choosing who you feel drawn to, what insults you tolerate, and what situations you repeat. Here's a story. Marian, 67, retired teacher. She's always been the dependable one, kept everything running, managed her emotions like a military operation. Her youngest son forgot her birthday, not the first time, but this time she went completely numb. Not angry, not teary, just quiet and vacant like the air left the room. She said it's fine. But inside, it wasn't about the birthday. It was about every time she made herself smaller to be loved. Every moment she gave without being asked. Every time she was useful instead of visible. The pain wasn't new. It was stored. And it took one careless moment to access an entire archive of silence and self-denial. That's how trauma behaves. It doesn't need big events. It just needs the right conditions. And if you don't recognize where it lives, you'll spend your life blaming whoever walks through the wrong emotional doorway. So what now? It's tempting to try to control other people, to make them speak softer, show up on time, use better words. But that's not healing, that's management. Real healing begins when you stop trying to change the trigger and start tracing it. When you ask, why does this feel so familiar? You're not broken. You're responding to a script that was written before you knew you had a say. But now you do. The mind tells you, they hurt me. The deeper truth is, they reminded me of a time I was already hurting. If you can hold that, everything changes. You won't stop feeling. You're not supposed to, but you'll stop falling apart every time someone behaves badly. You'll stop making their actions a statement about your worth. Most importantly, you'll stop running your life from a place you didn't choose. The next part of this journey is about finding those places. Not to judge them, not to fix them. Just to acknowledge they're there, so they stop running the show behind your back. Next up, what happens when you stop trying to manage your reactions and actually learn where they come from? Your triggers aren't random. They're the parts of you still waiting for closure. Let's go there. Part 2. You don't have triggers. You have landmines. Let's clear something up. You don't have triggers. You have unmarked explosives buried under decades of emotional detours. People around you might think you're overreacting, but when you've spent most of your life minimizing your pain, any honest reaction looks like an explosion. A comment sounds harmless to someone else hits you like a direct insult. Not because the words were sharp, but because they touched something you never finished grieving. That's not drama. That's memory. You've built a life on managing discomfort. You downplay things. You let things go. You tell yourself not to make a fuss. Eventually, those choices build a psychological minefield, and nobody, not even you, has a map. Let me tell you about Stan. He's 74. Quiet, polite, the kind of man who refolds napkins at restaurants and thinks anger is undignified. His granddaughter made a joke about him being out of touch, and without warning, he raised his voice for the first time in years. It shocked everyone. But it wasn't about the joke. It was about feeling irrelevant in a family that used to need him. That comment didn't offend him. It confirmed a fear he'd never named. That's what buried pain does. It doesn't go away. It waits. It finds the perfect moment to remind you it still exists. From the outside, it might look like you're being reactive. From the inside, it feels like trying to walk through your own life without setting yourself off. You're not over-emotional. You're carrying unprocessed experiences that still believe they're happening. The solution isn't to suppress your responses. That just strengthens the cycle. What you ignore becomes more unpredictable. What you turn toward becomes manageable. Avoidance feels safe, but it creates tension. You begin to organize your life around not being disturbed. You stay silent when something stings. You walk on eggshells in your own home. That's not peace. That's a strategy, and it doesn't work for long. The mind tries to manage pain with logic. It says, this shouldn't bother me. But the body doesn't care about what should or shouldn't matter. It only knows what hasn't been resolved. This is where Buddhist psychology is brutally honest. The problem isn't the pain, it's the resistance to it. Trying to avoid what hurts only gives it more control. You stop the pain from moving, but you also stop it from healing. The goal isn't to eliminate triggers. The goal is to understand them so they lose their grip. Once you see where the landmines are, you don't live in fear of them anymore. You make space around them. You stop walking blindly into the same emotional traps. You also stop expecting others to navigate your minefield for you. That part matters. People can be careful, but they can't be responsible for your healing. That's your job. Healing isn't about becoming less sensitive. It's about becoming more precise. Knowing the difference between what's happening now and what your nervous system thinks is happening again. This clarity takes time, especially later in life, when you've already made peace with being misunderstood. But there's still space to become more honest with yourself. You don't need to explain your pain to everyone. You just need to stop denying it to yourself. Next, we'll talk about the mask you've been wearing. The one that says you're fine, unbothered, even enlightened. But it's not freedom if it's another performance. Let's take a closer look at what the ego really is, and why it's the most exhausting costume party you've ever been to. Part 3. The ego is the world's most exhausting costume party. By the time you hit a certain age, you start to realize you've been playing a role longer than you've been living your actual life. You've been the strong one, the reliable one, the forgiving one, maybe the quiet one who keeps the peace, or the busy one who never asks for help. Whatever mask you chose, it probably worked, until it didn't. The ego doesn't start as vanity, it starts as armor. You had a need that went unmet, so you became the version of yourself most likely to avoid rejection. Over time, it became your identity. That's why you feel off when things are calm. That version of you only knows how to operate in chaos. If no one needs saving, fixing, or entertaining, You don't know what to do with yourself. This isn't a personality issue. It's a survival strategy that overstayed its welcome. The ego isn't just loud and arrogant. It's also quiet and exhausted. It's the voice that tells you to keep the smile on even when you're crumbling. It's the part that cares deeply about appearing put together, even when you're barely holding it together. People talk about letting go of the ego like it's a spiritual milestone. In reality, it feels more like grief. You're not just giving up a role. You're letting go of the person you became to feel safe. There's no shame in it. At some point it served you, but you're not in that situation anymore. You're older now. You're allowed to put it down. The problem is, the ego doesn't exit quietly. It bargains. It shames you for being honest. It tells you that if you drop the mask, no one will stick around. And sometimes that's true. Some people were only ever attached to the role you played in their lives, not the person underneath. When you start to unmask, you lose a few people. But you also start to feel the first real breath you've taken in years. Buddhist psychology describes this as the unraveling of attachment, not just to people, but to identity. When you stop being someone, space opens up for you to become something real. Aging has a strange way of forcing this. The older you get, the harder it is to maintain the mask. Not because you stop caring, but because the weight of pretending begins to interfere with your ability to actually live. Your body slows down. Your tolerance for superficial conversations thins. The version of you that could manage everyone's expectations starts running out of fuel. And that's not a crisis. It's a doorway. What happens if you walk through it? You stop needing to prove yourself. You start noticing who respects you when you're not performing. You begin to tolerate silence because you're no longer terrified of hearing your own thoughts. At first, this makes you feel exposed, vulnerable, maybe even lost. But over time, it starts to feel like relief. You no longer have to control the narrative. You don't have to win the conversation or be the one who always has it together. You're just human, awake, and finally honest. That's where real presence begins. Not in perfection, not in enlightenment, but in dropping the act. In Buddhist tradition, presence isn't about stillness on the outside. It's about no longer resisting the truth on the inside. So if you're feeling the pull to shed the image you've held together for most of your life, trust that impulse. It's not regression, it's evolution. Up next, we look at what happens when this internal shift begins. The discomfort, the confusion, and the strange quiet that comes after you stop performing. It doesn't always feel like peace at first. Sometimes it feels like emptiness. But emptiness, as we'll see, isn't a lack. It's a clearing. Part 4, you're not dying, you're molting. There's a point where the old version of you doesn't work anymore. Not because you've outgrown it gracefully, but because it starts to rot. You don't suddenly wake up enlightened. You wake up annoyed, confused, and increasingly uninterested in small talk. You feel disconnected from the life you built, the relationships you kept, even the identity you've worn for decades. People ask what's wrong, and you don't have an answer. Everything just feels off. You're not depressed, you're molting. Snakes shed skin, crabs leave old shells. Trees drop their leaves and look dead for a season. But in humans, we don't have rituals for shedding. We just panic and call it a crisis. This is the part where most people think something's gone wrong. You start canceling plans that once felt essential. You find yourself quiet in conversations you used to lead. You can't fake enthusiasm, and you stop pretending you don't notice who drains you. This isn't regression. It's clarity. It's your nervous system finally realizing it's tired of the noise. It's your spirit wanting out of the performance. And it doesn't always feel good, especially when you realize that most of what you've built wasn't designed for who you're becoming. There's loss in this. You lose the roles you used to lean on. You lose comfort in old routines. Sometimes you lose people who only knew how to love the version of you that was always available, agreeable, or easy to manage. Buddhist teaching refers to this as emptiness, but not in the way most people fear. Emptiness here isn't hollow, it's spacious. It's the absence of false identity. It's the part where you stop clinging to things that were never stable in the first place. But it doesn't happen cleanly. Sometimes it looks like sleeping too much, or waking up too early. Sometimes it shows up as forgetting what day it is, or crying during a song you haven't heard since the 80s. It can be quiet, it can be sharp, but it always feels like you're being emptied out by something that refuses to explain itself. That's because what's dying isn't you. It's the illusion that you had to be someone else to be okay. Let me tell you about Leonard. He's 69, former accountant, the type of man who always had a retirement plan and never skipped a haircut. One day, he stopped going to the club he'd been attending for 15 years. Didn't say why, just stopped. His wife asked if something was wrong, and he said, "I think I'm done performing for people I don't even like." That's molting. Not dramatic, not chaotic, just a quiet decision to stop feeding parts of your life that no longer feel real. You're not unraveling. You're becoming honest. What feels like death is usually the end of your tolerance for false peace. You stop needing to be understood. You stop trying to earn space in rooms that feel cold. You stop talking yourself into staying where your soul already left. And it's uncomfortable because no one throws you a party for this. There's no celebration when you stop attending to the emotional maintenance of others. Most people don't even notice. They just think you're acting different. They're right, you are. What they don't see is that the quiet, strange space you're entering is the first step toward freedom. Real freedom. The kind that doesn't need explanation or applause. Molting isn't dramatic. It's subtle. It's sacred. It looks like nothing. It changes everything. In the next part, we're going to explore what happens when you stop running from pain and start recognizing its message. Not every wound is meant to be healed. Some are meant to be understood. And once they are, they lose their power. Ready? Part 5. When you stop running, your monsters stop chasing. You've spent most of your life avoiding pain like it was contagious. You changed jobs, changed cities, changed your tone in conversations, just to stay 3 steps ahead of anything uncomfortable. And for a while, it worked. Until it didn't. Because here's the truth most people don't want to hear. Pain doesn't go away when ignored. It waits. It finds side doors. It changes clothes. What you don't face becomes what you repeat. Buddhism doesn't suggest we fight pain. It asks us to stop running from it. Not because suffering is noble, but because avoidance makes it louder. You don't have anxiety because your mind is broken. You have anxiety because you've trained your nervous system to expect danger whenever things feel quiet. You've spent so many years bracing for impact that stillness feels unsafe. This is why things fall apart when they finally calm down. It's also why people self-sabotage. Not because they enjoy chaos, but because chaos is familiar. Stillness reveals everything you buried to survive. You say you don't know why you're angry, or why you can't sleep, or why you keep pushing people away even though you don't want to be alone. You do know. You've just built such a strong habit of avoiding those conversations with yourself that it feels like a mystery. The monsters aren't new. They're just more obvious now that you're too tired to distract yourself. Let me tell you about Janice. She's 71, grandmother of 4. Spent most of her life making things easier for everyone around her. Cooked through grief, smiled through disrespect, laughed off dismissive comments from her husband, her friends, even her grown children. Then one afternoon, sitting in traffic, she felt like she couldn't breathe. Not a panic attack. More like her body had decided it was done being polite. She said later, "I think my silence finally started to push back." When you stop running, you meet the parts of yourself you tried to leave behind. Not to punish you, but to be acknowledged. The pain doesn't want you to collapse. It wants you to stop pretending you're fine. That's why avoidance doesn't bring peace. It just delays the inevitable. Pain doesn't get smaller because you avoid it. It gets buried. And buried pain leaks into conversations, seeps into relationships, reshapes your habits. You're not reacting to the present, you're reenacting the past. Buddhist teachings refer to this as the second arrow. The first arrow is what happens to you. The second arrow is the story you tell yourself afterward. You can't always control the first, but you keep firing the second, over and over. This always happens to me. People always leave. I should have known better. Maybe I deserved it. You're not in pain from what happened. You're in pain from how long you've been carrying the belief that it defines you. So what now? Stop performing calm and start practicing honesty. When sadness shows up, let it stay long enough to say what it came to say. When anger surfaces, don't send it to the guest house out back. Ask it what it's protecting. This isn't about staying broken. It's about finally sitting still long enough to understand what's been asking for your attention all these years. The moment you stop running, the chase ends. The pain doesn't vanish, but it changes shape. It becomes something you can carry without being consumed by it. You're not weak for feeling it. You're strong enough now to stop pretending you don't. Next, we're going to explore what happens when that internal shift starts costing you things. Your friendships change, your tolerance shrinks, your social calendar clears itself. And at first, that feels like isolation, but it's something else entirely. Let's look at why peace often looks like loneliness, right before it turns into freedom. Part 6. Enlightenment feels like loneliness at first. The further you walk into clarity, the quieter it gets. At first, that silence feels like peace, until you notice how many people have vanished. Or maybe they're still there, but something in you no longer responds the same way. Conversations that used to fill hours now feel hollow. Jokes that once made you laugh now make you tired. This is common. And no, you're not being difficult. You're just done playing along. When you stop pretending, your circle shrinks. People you once called friends begin to drift. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because the version of you they connected with doesn't exist anymore. And they don't know how to meet the one that's left. It's not personal. It's predictable. You're no longer agreeing out of habit. You're not pretending to care when you don't. You're done being the stable one, the wise one, the one who keeps things light. You're not interested in shallow comfort. You want conversations that go somewhere or none at all. And that's a problem for the people who depended on your performance. This phase is subtle but sharp. You find yourself sitting at gatherings and wondering how you used to enjoy them. You listen to people talk and feel like you're watching a play you've already seen too many times. You used to know all the lines. Now you just want to go home. There's no drama in it, just distance. That distance isn't rejection. It's truth with nothing left to prove. Buddhist teaching doesn't frame this as loss. It names it clearly, non-attachment, the falling away of what no longer fits. Not because you've hardened, because you've stopped clinging to roles that made you feel included at the cost of feeling authentic. You haven't become cold, you've become selective. And yes, at first it feels lonely. You start to miss the noise, even when it used to drain you. You miss being understood, even though most of that understanding was built on your willingness to play a part. You miss the version of you who tolerated more than they should have, but only because they didn't know what it was costing them. That discomfort is part of the transition. It's what happens when you start replacing false connection with genuine presence. And that always takes time. This is the point where most people go back. They reattach, they re-engage, they soften their truth to avoid the tension of being fully seen. They apologize for pulling away, even though it was the most honest thing they've done in years. Don't do that. You're not drifting. You're aligning. You're creating space for the relationships that can actually meet you where you are now, not where you had to stay to be accepted before. Let me tell you about Ruth. She's 76. She used to host weekly bridge games, bake for everyone's birthday, and check in on her neighbors more than her own children. Then she stopped. Not because she was bitter, but because she realized she had built an entire community on service, not reciprocity. When she stopped giving, people stopped calling. It hurt. But it clarified. Eventually, one person called just to ask how she was, not for a favor, not for a recipe, just to talk. And that one conversation felt more real than years of polite obligation. That's what begins to replace the loneliness. Not a flood of new people, but a few real ones who don't need the old version of you to feel comfortable. Enlightenment, if you want to call it that, isn't a light show. It's a slow, unglamorous clearing of everything that was built on fear, approval, and pretense. It's what happens when you stop trading authenticity for belonging. Up next, we'll talk about what actually protects you, because it's not distance, it's not boundaries made from bitterness, it's something simpler and stronger, clarity. Let's get into that. Part 7. Consciousness is the only real armor you've spent years trying to protect yourself, through silence, strategy, and the occasional passive-aggressive smile. You've tried distance. You've tried over-explaining. You've tried staying pleasant long after the conversation stopped being kind. None of it worked. Here's why. Protection doesn't come from pulling away. It comes from understanding what's yours and what isn't. Consciousness is what gives you that understanding, not the kind that turns you into a detached observer who floats through life saying, "I'm above this." That's just spiritual denial with a nicer font. Real consciousness is gritty. It's specific. It knows when a conversation is about the present and when it's digging up something you buried 3 decades ago. You don't need more tools. You need to stop outsourcing your stability to other people's behavior. If someone insults you and it stings for days, it's not because their words were accurate. It's because they touched a bruise you still haven't examined. Once you see the bruise clearly, the insult doesn't disappear, but it loses its grip. That's what clarity does. It doesn't shield you from pain. It makes pain easier to hold. There's a quiet strength in knowing your internal weather. You recognize the storms without mistaking them for signs of collapse. You feel disappointment and don't spiral. You feel anger and don't explode. You start to live from the center, not the edge. Buddhist psychology calls this mindfulness, but let's not turn it into a buzzword. It's not about becoming some enlightened monk who smiles through nonsense. It's about knowing when your reaction is real and when it's recycled. It's about knowing when to speak, when to leave, and when to stop carrying conversations in your head 3 days after they ended. The more conscious you are, the less people can shake you, because they're no longer bumping into things you're pretending not to feel. You don't need thicker skin. You need better boundaries between your story and theirs. Let me tell you about Paul. He's 73, recently divorced. He used to replay arguments in his head like they were courtroom transcripts. Every insult, every accusation memorized. After a while, he realized he wasn't hurt by what was said. He was haunted by how much of it he secretly believed. Once he saw that clearly, the conversation stopped looping. Not because he forgave everything, but because he finally understood what parts of it were his and what never belonged to him at all. That's the shift. You don't become immune to criticism. You become selective about which voices get past your inner gate. This doesn't make you cold. It makes you sane. And it changes how you move through life. You stop managing how you're perceived. You stop justifying your choices. You stop giving people emotional access they haven't earned. You begin to respond from clarity, not conditioning. That's what makes you feel untouchable. Not detachment, but integration. When your emotions don't own you, no one else can either. And here's the part no one tells you. People notice. Some pull away, some push harder, but the ones who stay will start showing up differently. Not because they've changed, but because they can finally feel that they're no longer speaking to your fear. They're speaking to you. This is what real armor looks like. Not silence, not distance, awareness. That's what keeps you steady when life doesn't. Next, we're going into new territory. You've done the work, you've faced the ghosts, but there's still one thing that keeps many people stuck: the habit of forgiving people who never asked and staying connected to stories that were never truly yours. Let's talk about that next. Part 8. Stop forgiving people who never asked you to. You've been told to forgive because it's the noble thing, the spiritual thing, the emotionally mature thing. But here's the uncomfortable truth. A lot of people who forgive early aren't healing. They're avoiding conflict. They call it closure. It's actually submission. You don't forgive because you've processed the pain. You forgive because you're tired of being labeled bitter. You want things to feel over, even if they're not. And the people you forgive, they rarely notice. They're not waiting, they've moved on. Sometimes they didn't even know they hurt you, or worse, they did and didn't care. But you did it anyway. You forgave them in silence. You buried the rest under grace. Then you wonder why the same sadness keeps leaking out years later. Forgiveness without acknowledgement isn't healing, it's internal gaslighting. You erase your anger, you suppress the grief. You pretend your boundaries were never crossed. That's not resolution. That's emotional house cleaning for someone else's benefit. In Buddhist practice, compassion isn't about excusing behavior. It's about seeing things clearly. Sometimes that clarity shows you that the healthiest thing you can do isn't to forgive, but to let go without reconciling. You don't owe closure to someone who never showed up with accountability. You don't have to make peace with every story. Some are meant to stay closed, not out of hate, but because reopening them only reactivates pain you worked hard to contain. Let me tell you about Helen. She's 78, spent her whole life being the peacemaker in a family that never noticed the weight she carried. Her brother borrowed money for years, promised to pay her back, and never did. When he got sick, she took care of him anyway. After he passed, she was so forgiving. What they didn't know is that she cried in private for weeks, not just out of grief, but because she realized no one had ever acknowledged what she gave up. Her forgiveness wasn't peace, it was resignation. What she needed wasn't praise. It was to finally say, "That wasn't okay, and I'm tired of pretending it was." Sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is tell the truth. Not to punish someone, but to stop protecting them from their own reflection. And if they're not around anymore, you can still tell the truth to yourself. I didn't deserve that. I should have been treated better. I kept showing up for someone who never did the same. I matter too. Forgiveness isn't a requirement. It's an option. And it only works when it comes from clarity, not guilt, not fear, and definitely not pressure from people who think discomfort is worse than dishonesty. You can let go without pretending it never hurt. You can move on without framing the other person as just doing their best. Some people were careless, some were cruel, some didn't grow, and some took advantage of the fact that you wouldn't call them out. That doesn't make you less spiritual. It makes you honest. Forgiveness, when rushed, becomes another performance. One more way to keep the peace at your own expense. One more way to disappear while calling it growth. You're not obligated to repair what someone else destroyed. You're allowed to carry your own truth without wrapping it in something softer for everyone else to feel comfortable. Next, we'll close this journey by replacing the concept of fine with something better. Something real. Because fine isn't freedom. It's what you say when you've given up explaining. Let's talk about what comes after that. Part 9. You're not meant to be fine. You're meant to be free. You've said it more times than you can count. I'm fine, I'm okay, it's nothing. But you weren't. And it was. Fine is a code word. It usually means, I've decided to tolerate this because I don't think I'm allowed to ask for more. You used it at funerals, at dinners you didn't want to attend, in conversations where your needs were invisible. And eventually, the habit stuck. Somewhere along the way, fine became your baseline. Not because you stopped caring, but because you got tired of explaining what hurt, only to have it minimized. You found it easier to self-soothe than to risk being misunderstood again. But let's be honest, fine is survival mode. It's a polite way of saying, I'm still here, but I've stopped expecting anything to feel better. There's no peace in that. There's just quiet resignation. Freedom, on the other hand, looks different. It's not dramatic. It doesn't need to announce itself. It's what happens when you stop negotiating with your own needs, when you stop shrinking to stay palatable, when you let go of the idea that being easy to love means being easy to ignore. Freedom means you stop lying to yourself in small ways. You don't say yes when you mean maybe. You don't apologize for having limits. You don't soften your voice to avoid someone else's discomfort. You say what you mean, you feel what you feel, and you let the rest fall where it needs to. There's loss in that. You lose people who preferred your silence. You lose routines that were built around being agreeable. You lose the image of yourself as someone who's always fine, always useful, always emotionally low maintenance. But what you gain is bigger. You get to breathe without checking the room first. You get to wake up without rehearsing who you need to be that day. You get to stop performing for acceptance and start living from something solid. Buddhist practice calls this returning to your original mind, before the conditioning, before the roles, before the story you were assigned about who you had to be. It's not a mystical state, it's simple. You come home to yourself. Let me tell you about Eileen. She's 82, widowed twice, spent decades being the glue for a family that didn't realize she was dissolving. One day she stopped. She gave away the china, sold the house, moved into a small apartment, and got a dog named Howard. She spends her mornings walking him, drinking strong coffee, and reading in silence. Someone asked her recently if she ever gets lonely. She said, No, I just finally stopped calling chaos company. That's freedom. You don't need to be fixed. You're not a project. You're not behind schedule. You've made it through things that would have broken most people. You've kept going long after your inner world told you to stop. You've stayed generous when it wasn't returned. You've kept showing up. That matters. But now the invitation is different. Not to push harder, not to pretend louder, but to live with nothing to prove. You're not meant to be fine. You're meant to be real, present, whole, unapologetically aware of what you need and who you no longer need to be. This is the end of the performance and the beginning of the real relationship with yourself. If you've made it this far, you already know. This wasn't just a video, it was a reckoning. Now it's your turn to respond. In the comments, if you're ready, just write, "I'm not fine." Say it with clarity, say it with love, say it without shame. That sentence doesn't mean something's wrong. It means you're alive, and that is more than enough. If you've made it to the end of this video, either you're incredibly patient or your soul knew this was the conversation you've been avoiding for decades. We covered a lot. We peeled off the mask called "I'm fine," stepped over the landmines we mistook for personality quirks, and dropped the exhausting ego costumes that never fit right in the first place. We talked about why forgiveness without acknowledgement isn't healing. It's emotional housekeeping for people who never cleaned up their mess. And most of all, we reminded ourselves that silence isn't spiritual. It's often just fear in fancy robes. But now you know, you're not meant to be untouchable. You're meant to be whole. And the path to wholeness? It starts where you stop telling the truth to yourself. So if something in this video struck a nerve, in a good way, or even an uncomfortable one, don't keep it to yourself. Drop a comment and share the one part that really landed. Someone else probably needs to hear it too. If you found value in this, like and subscribe, not because it feeds the algorithm, but because it helps us reach 1,000 subscribers and keeps this channel alive for others who've also been performing strength for too long. Thanks for watching Buddhist Wisdom for the Elderly. You're not broken. You're just remembering who you were before the world convinced you to hide. Now go make a cup of tea. You've earned it.